I'm speaking with David Gilbert, Middle East correspondent for CBS News. David grew up in the Bay Area and has lived in Israel since the year 2000. He holds a degree in international management and public policy from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He also spent a year at the London School of Economics and Political Science as a Rotary International Ambassadorial Scholar. David, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Marty. Good to see you.
Dave, you've done a lot of reporting from the Palestinian territories. I have heard that sometimes people in those territories are under a lot of pressure to report favorably about the Palestinians. And if you report unfavorably, you might not be able to continue reporting. Have you ever experienced that type of pressure?
So I've heard that as well, and the short answer is no. I haven't experienced that kind of pressure. I know many of my Arab colleagues, primarily Arab Palestinian colleagues and the like, they are definitely intimidated. There's been cases where they've been shot, they've been beaten, there have been lots of sort of gory things that have happened to them as a result of their reporting. People like me, American journalists, generally the PLO feels that they want to sort of kill you with kindness. They want to give you everything you need, call me at 2 o'clock in the morning, whatever I can do for you in order to get my message across. They very much see us as pawns to be used, that they get their message out for free by talking to us. So my experience has been generally that they are more than willing to roll out the red carpet and to do everything that they can in order to allow me to do my job better.
Is there any kind of self-censorship where you know that if you report certain things they won't like it, so you voluntarily refrain from doing that?
Look, I broke the story that Arafat was harboring wanted terrorists in his compound, and they still talk to me and we still do business. They may not like me. I don't know. I don't care, frankly. But they do see that they need to deal with me, and they do continue to deal with me, despite maybe some reservations they have about my coverage.
Now, it appears that the whole Palestinian area may be sliding toward a civil war. There's a lot of tension between Hamas and Fatah. There have been many shootings. People have been killed. Does it seem possible that the whole area will descend into total chaos?
It seemed possible about 2 weeks ago. I think if you'd asked me that 2 weeks ago, I would have told you it's pretty likely that it's going to descend into civil war. Frankly, both Hamas and Fatah have been arming themselves to the hilt over the last several months, from both in Gaza and in the West Bank. Hamas trying to strengthen itself in the West Bank, Fatah strengthening itself in Gaza. What's interesting is that the Israelis always seem to come in at the moment that Hamas and Fatah are ready to fight each other, and they do something which triggers anger against Israel and triggers unity amongst the various terrorist factions. And again, they did it just this last week. Hamas and Fatah were within inches of a civil war, and now they're within inches of a national unity government in which there's going to be some sort of a face that's put on the Hamas government that's palatable to the West. The money is going to be triggered into the coffers of the PLO again, and I think it's Israel that's actually saved the Hamas government, unwittingly perhaps.
Is this unity for public consumption? Has anything really changed? Because Hamas has said very clearly that they will never give up their campaign to wipe Israel off the map.
In fact, the would-be Hamas prime minister and others in Hamas have made clear that despite the unity government, the policy still stands the same. They're going to destroy Israel no matter how long it takes. It could take 50 years, it could take 10 years, it could take 100 years. But you're right, it's certainly for public consumption. I don't think anybody believes that Hamas is going to change its stripes. That's one thing that you have to respect about Hamas, in the sense that they have an ideology, they stick with it come hell or high water.
Is that unlike Fatah, which also wants to destroy Israel, but is clever enough to pretend to be interested in peace?
Ultimately, Marty, you're right. The Hamas and the Fatah have very similar agendas. They simply speak in different languages. Mr. Arafat, who was the head of Fatah for many years, talked in English about wanting peace in 2 states and the like, spoke in Arabic about wiping the Jews out, throwing them into the sea. Hamas has the same goal, but the difference comes in terms of the language, in terms of Hamas not willing to compromise even their language in English or in Arabic. Fatah willing to say nice things in English for the most part, and Abu Mazen being willing, the PLO chairman, being willing to shake people's hands and say the right things in front of the cameras. But ultimately, the charter the PLO has for the last 40 years has not changed. That they want the right of return. They want to eliminate the state of Israel in a series of stages.
Now, this is very interesting because the Israeli government seems to be doing everything that it can to bolster Mahmoud Abbas in the hopes of using him as a kind of counterweight against Hamas. They're describing him as a peace partner. They're providing him with weapons. They're providing him with a lot of things. Now, does this make sense? But he is just as committed to Israel's destruction as Hamas, isn't he?
It's a little hard to understand, frankly. Publicly, in the statements that Abu Mazen makes in Arabic, he doesn't speak out in the last 3 or 4 years or so. He doesn't speak out about throwing Israel to the sea and tearing apart the Jewish state. And I think as a result of that, the Israelis have been perhaps cowed into a belief that he is moderate and that he wants two states for two peoples. In reality, I think the jury is very much still out. He hasn't lifted a finger yet in the last 3 years since he's been either prime minister or the chairman of the PLO to actually root out any of the terrorists, to actually arrest terrorists, to actually take weapons away from terrorists. He's talked a lot about doing that, but he hasn't actually taken any action against them. So it's frankly a little hard to understand why the Israelis are willing to go along with Abu Mazen. Part of it is that most of the world likes the narrative of having two states for two peoples and two partners to talk about two states for two peoples, and Abu Mazen represents the partner to talk about making this vision of two people living in the same land.
Is it possible that Israel is in a state of denial where they're so anxious for peace that they will believe any Arab or any Palestinian who expresses even the slightest interest in peace, even if it's transparently false?
Well, Marty, there are many books written, psychological books, analyzing the Israeli condition, and people liken it to a battered wife, for instance, where she blames herself for the beating. Despite the fact that her husband is beating her, it's his fault, it's his problem, he's the one who's doing it. The Israelis have been beaten and beaten and beaten, and at some point there's this psychological phenomenon where you begin to empathize and sympathize with your oppressor, as it were. And I think the Israelis have come to the point where they've had so much terrorism and so much stress over the last 60 years that they are looking for any ray of hope and are willing to be sort of myopic in terms of any ray of hope, latching onto it and hoping that it can actually bring some sort of a stable situation.
The threats against Israel seem to be increasing on every front right now in proportion to how much they're willing to give away to the Arabs. The Lebanese front is still very threatening. There are missile attacks and rocket attacks from Gaza just about every day. The Arabs are trying to open up another front in the West Bank. Syria is acting more belligerently than it has in years. Iran is promising to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. What is the mood of the average Israeli right now? Are they worried? Are they optimistic? And if they're optimistic, what are they basing that on?
Israelis are always optimistic, despite the threats from Iran being the most serious threat and on down the line from there. Israelis are used to conflict, they're used to difficulties, they're used to challenges, and they've risen above those challenges time and time again. And I think you still find an ethos of positivity and excitement and hope for a better future. Now, if you do a poll on the leaders of Israel, Ehud Olmert in particular has got about a 20% approval rating. He's the prime minister. The defense minister, who's the senior party in the coalition, has got about a 15% approval rating. There is not much confidence in the leadership of Israel. And you could argue that means that people are not particularly optimistic about the future. I think people are optimistic about the long-term future, and they see some challenges in the near term, but that I think they realize that they'll overcome this just like they've overcome many, many obstacles before.
There have been a huge amount of recriminations in Israel because of the failures of the war in Lebanon. Do you think that these recriminations will get to the point that the government will actually be forced from power?
No, I don't think the government will be forced from power. I think in many countries they would be forced from power if the results were the same. If it was, Prime Minister Olmert promised a crushing defeat. He told me and a number of other people privately during the war that we are going to take it to them, we are going to murder them, we are going to cut off their heads and destroy Hezbollah. Clearly they weren't able to do that. Perhaps they didn't try to do that. I mean, the jury's still out in terms of there are many people within the army who believe that the handcuffs were on the IDF, and that's why the IDF failed. They were simply not given the orders to really go in and conquer the situation and deal with the situation. I think Olmert is going to survive primarily because of the system. Almost everybody in the Israeli political system looks at the polls right now and says, look, if we go to elections right now, our party is going to lose power. Is going to lose seats. Both the Kadima party, which is the ruling party, the Labor Party, which is the partner party, and the Pensioners Party, which is the third partner party, they're all drastically reduced in the public opinion polls as a result of this war. So nobody's interested in calling new elections. Obviously the opposition is very interested, but they are not the majority at this stage, and so it's very unlikely that they would be able to abolish the Knesset and go to a new election at this stage.
Do you think the implementation of the war in Lebanon was bad, or were the goals themselves wrong? The government never spoke about victory. It never really talked about winning, at least as I recall.
Privately, Mr. Olmert certainly did in public. I think he also talked about crushing and dealing a death blow to Hezbollah. He perhaps promised more than he was able to deliver. Mr. Danny Chalutz, who's the chief of staff of the Israeli army, he is a former Air Force general and a former Air Force commander, and I think he sold the cabinet a bill of goods, as it were. He thought that the Air Force would be enough to crush Hezbollah, crush their long-range, their short-range missile capability, and that would be enough to make them cry uncle. In the end, the Air Force did tremendous amounts of damage to Hezbollah within about the first 15 hours of the war. They took out almost the entire medium to long-range missile threat against Israel, and that's probably the reason Hezbollah didn't fire missiles on Tel Aviv or on Jerusalem, because they didn't have the capability. However, at the end of the day, it takes a ground force in order to subdue a guerrilla force which is on the ground. It's not enough to simply bomb the place unless you carpet bomb the place, and that's something that Israel
and this force is so opposed to Israel, they're willing to take an enormous amount of punishment, apparently. They're willing to die if need be in order to kill Jews.
So they are certainly of the ideology that their ideology comes before their life, that if one becomes a martyr, if one is killed in pursuit of an infidel, one gets a greater portion in the world to come, and that's seen as much more valuable than anything in this world, in this life.
And they've really internalized that, so the average person, I know he's been propagandized to believe this. All of his teachers have told him this all his life.
Many people, that's true. I mean, I'll speak in the speech we're going to give in a little bit about some of the things that the people are telling me on the streets of Gaza and on the streets of Ramallah, and certainly the people that are in Hezbollah are hardcore believers that Allah's will is above all else, and Allah's will in this case is to rid this land of the infidels and to give your life if it takes to do that.
The Olmert government recently expanded its governing coalition by bringing a party called Yisrael Beitenu into it, headed by Avigdor Lieberman, a Russian Jew. Now, what is the significance of bringing Lieberman into the government? They created a special position for him, Minister of Strategic Affairs, named him a Deputy Prime Minister, and yet he is considered very opposite to a lot of the left-wing parties, the Labour Party, and so on.
One word, survival. That's what Mr. Olmert is looking for. In bringing Mr. Lieberman into the cabinet, it bolsters his coalition. It enables him to pass a budget to actually govern, which is the budgetary issue is the most difficult issue for any prime minister in terms of passing his programming. And it buys him some time. It's a life vest for Mr. Olmert. It allows him to say, look, we have a stable coalition. We're not going to have votes of confidence that are going to topple us anytime soon. And yes, the reality is that Lieberman and Olmert don't see eye to eye on very key issues, and certainly the Labour Party and Mr. Lieberman do not agree on much of anything, whether it's economics or security policy or the like. But at the moment, both the Labour and the Kadima parties are so weak that they're looking for anybody to come in to give them a Volvo so that they can be a minister and they can sit at the cabinet table and survive, as opposed to not bringing Mr. Lieberman in, which might lead to Bibi Netanyahu peeling off some Kadima members and perhaps forming an alternate coalition.
Now, Olmert seems very anxious to make new concessions to the Palestinians. He's been saying in recent days that he's ready to make all kinds of concessions, and people are just going to be amazed at how much he's going to give. Now, I don't understand why an Israeli prime minister is so anxious to give concessions to Israel's enemies. Is he buckling under some kind of external pressure, or is this really what he wants to do?
There is quite a lot of external pressure from the Arab countries, from the European countries, and from some in the State Department here in America that try to pressure the Israelis to offer up concessions because it's seen as movement forward in the peace process. Everybody wants to push the peace process forward without even asking whether that process is a just process or an accurate process or an effective process to bring about an end to the conflict. They're simply interested in pushing it forward to be able to tell each other that they're sort of doing something good for the region and bringing the flames down, as it were. Mr. Olmert himself, I think, very much would like to be liked by the world. He would like people to respect him. He knows that in Israel he's not at all respected. He happens to be in Los Angeles today, where I was, and he's there speaking to the United Jewish Communities, the biggest Jewish group in America. He'll get a big standing ovation there, the likes of which he wouldn't get if he was in Israel right now.
Everybody is talking about the peace process, but is there really a peace process? It seems to me that there's only one side that's interested in peace, and that's Israel. The Arab side is interested in victory. They know what they want. They want to wipe Israel off the map, according to what all their spokesmen say. So is it fair to say that the entire peace process is essentially a myth, that Israel has been conned, and there has never been any intention on the Arab side to make genuine peace?
Many people point that out. I mean, vis-a-vis Arafat, that Mr. Arafat was willing to take land, up to 98 to 99% of the Arabs in that area were under Mr. Arafat's rule at the height of the peace process. And just at that very height, that's when the terrorism of the last 6 years kicked off and thousands of people lost their lives on both sides of the conflict as a result of this terrorism. So certainly there are those that would point out that this process didn't lead to the ultimate solution of some sort of a peace between the two peoples. In fact, it was there are those that would argue, as you've argued, that when Israel appears weak and appears tired, that the Arabs interpret that as weakness, as being tired, and simply as like a shark around blood. They simply go for the jugular at that stage. And I think there's plenty of people in the Middle Eastern societies and the Arab societies who see Israel as a paper tiger, that if you keep bombing and if you keep continuing the terrorist attacks, that ultimately Israel will buckle. Mr. Sharon, the strongest Israeli general that they've ever had, pulled out of Gaza in the wake of 5,000 mortars, rockets, and other projectiles coming into the Israeli communities in that area. So if Mr. Sharon was willing to buckle, then of course we know Mr. Olmert is not nearly as strong as Mr. Sharon is. The logic goes, and of course if we continue the terrorism, Mr. Olmert will buckle even more than Mr. Sharon did.
So are the Arabs right that Israel is in a process of buckling, that they're unable to stand up? In 1967, Israel won an enormous victory over the combined Arab states. In those days, the Palestinians were considered a marginal threat at best, and people were saying that Israel's survival was assured because it can not only defeat any Arab nation, it can defeat any combination of Arab nations. And we don't hear much of that kind of talk anymore. So what changed? Did Israel change? Did it lose its nerve somehow?
Well, there's a feeling certainly after the war with Hezbollah, Bashar al-Assad in Syria and others around the region are sort of licking their chops. They feel that maybe Israel isn't the strength that it was back in 1967 or even in defeating them ultimately in 1973. And that's why you're seeing talk of peace on Bashar al-Assad in English, but in Arabic he's telling his people very much that we're about ready to jump onto the Golan because Israel is not going to be willing to defend it, and we can win a conventional war against them. He's wrong. I mean, he's dead wrong in his calculation, and the only hope is that he knows he's dead wrong and that he won't actually unleash any sort of an attack because he's going to pay dearly for it. His people are going to pay dearly for it, and frankly, the Israeli people will pay deeply for it because the Golan Heights is not very well defended. In the initial days of the war, there would be tremendous casualties, and sadly, the Israelis have allowed a situation to exist that they don't reinforce the Golan when they probably should. But ultimately, I forgot what your question was ultimately. What was the...
Well, that's okay. I'll ask another one. How strong is the religious sector in Israel? The Arabs are waging what might be called a religious war, but Israel also has a very strong religious sector. Many people say that the Jewish nation is ultimately founded on religious ideas, and it's the current government's lack of adherence to these ideas which is the cause of most of their problems, because without adherence to these ideas, they don't have the courage to stand up and say this land is ours and we're not giving any of it away.
So there are certainly those who would point out that the Israeli society seems to have lost its way in some respects. It used to be that, as you said, that
sense of purpose.
Many Israelis had not only a sense of purpose, but a sense that the purpose was made for that piece of land there, not Namibia or not Uganda or some other sort of land in the middle of nowhere. That this land was uniquely suited for the Jewish people to do what they need to be doing in this world. And I think there's certainly evidence to suggest that many Israelis are not only leaving the country, wanting to move to America because they can have a better material life and the like, and are less concerned about building a Jewish society in the land of Israel, which is certainly, I think, the initial goal that people had when they came back to the land in the 1880s or so, and subsequently. So there are many people making that argument, talking about post-Zionism and neo-Zionism and the like, and there are many, I think, that are grappling with that issue. What is the purpose? Is it to have a nation like every other nation, to be just like America in the Middle East, or is it to be a unique nation that's going to be a light to the rest of the world, an example to the rest of the world? And the jury's still out on that debate. There are certainly those very strongly on each side. And at the moment, I would say it's tipping towards those who want to be America in the Middle East and want to be a materialistic country that doesn't necessarily have different values than any other country in the world.
But if a particular approach seems to fail and seems not to get good results, it's reasonable that the people would want to try something different after a while.
Certainly. I mean, there's everybody's tired of the situation of buses being blown up and terrorism for the last 120 years plus. So everybody you talk to in Israel is certainly interested in any new solution that one can have, but there aren't new solutions that are being proffered. They're simply recycled solutions.
Now, one thing that people find it hard to understand is the level of hatred that the Arabs seem to have toward Israel. Now, some people say, who are pro-Arab, say, well, they have no choice but to feel this hatred because of the things that Israel has done to them. And other people say they do have a choice, and this is their choice. They have chosen to hate because they regard hatred as a weapon. Hatred will make their enemies be afraid of them and run away. And so they're not looking for reasons to draw down their hatred. They're looking for reasons to intensify their hatred. They fire at Israelis, and if Israelis shoot back, they immediately scream to the world that a war crime has been committed. So is it fair to say that they use hatred as a weapon, and they're intentionally trying to keep their hatred at the highest level possible, and they value their hatred?
The Hamas leadership and the PLO leadership, I think, understands that hatred is a very potent weapon. You can see it from the various TV stations and the like that are aired throughout the PLO, that they're certainly accentuating any mistake that Israel makes, and Israel has not been perfect. There's no doubt about that. But every small mistake that Israel makes is certainly blown into a very large mistake. And, for instance, the Jenin massacre of 2002, that allegedly Israel lined up thousands of Arabs and shot them down and buried them in a mass grave. It never happened. I was there afterwards. There was no mass grave on the street that they told us it existed on. However, if you talk to people, and I've subsequently talked to many people on the streets of the West Bank and Gaza, they believe that it happened. They know their cousin's brother's best friend's sister who was murdered in that incident. And no matter what I do to tell them that I was there, it didn't happen, they will never believe me. So I think certainly the PLO leadership and the Hamas leadership understands that they can harness this hatred for their purposes, which apparently is prolonging the conflict until they can win the entire land.
And they have their own media, so if you read it in the Palestinian media, why shouldn't you believe it if you're a Palestinian?
There are many that believe that any media that isn't Arab is controlled by the Israelis, and so the only media that they tend to believe is Al Jazeera and Al Ayam and all the different PLO dailies that come out, and they believe it. They really believe things that are somewhat absurd.
It sometimes seems that a lot of the press tilts more toward the Palestinians than toward the Israelis, especially the foreign press, but sometimes in the U.S. too. They seem to give more credence to the Palestinian side. Every accusation receives large play and is taken at face value, whereas if Israel accuses the Palestinians of something, it gets less play and is treated with more skepticism. First of all, would you say that that's an accurate observation, that this in fact occurs?
I think that there's a certain narrative that's taken hold about this conflict, that there's an underdog and there's an overdog, and that the Israelis, who were once the underdog, have now become the most powerful military in the world, and they are repressing the Palestinians in the way that the Nazis repressed the Jews. It's a very interesting imagery, and it makes for a telling story. It's not particularly accurate. However, anything that deviates from that narrative tends to have difficulty penetrating the coverage. In other words, a journalist comes to the Middle East with a certain perception about who's right and who's wrong, and that if they would simply compromise and if Israel would give a little bit, then there would be peace and everybody could live a happy life. It hasn't been my experience that that's effective. However, that's certainly the perception that most journalists take into the conflict. And when you have that certain, beginning perception, everything you see comes through that lens and is perhaps misinterpreted as a result of it.
Is this problem exacerbated by the fact that many Israelis themselves have an attitude of sympathizing with the enemy? If you read the Israeli press, they're constantly bemoaning the loss of Arab life. They treat Jewish religious settlers as if they were the enemy to be feared. And like Haaretz, for example, which is an English language newspaper, and that seems to justify it. I mean, if someone can say, well, even Jews are saying that Israel is in the wrong, so we can certainly say that they're in the wrong. Is that part of the problem?
Look, there are plenty of people that would point out that when you have people like Yossi Beilin or Shimon Peres, former Israeli cabinet ministers, who are coming out very forthrightly against Israeli policy, it makes it very easy for people who are anti-Israel to latch onto that and simply say, well, it's not us, that we're not anti-Semitic, we're not trying to tarnish Israel, we're simply echoing and parroting what some of Israel's leaders are saying. It's a bit of a problem because those people don't represent anywhere near the majority of the Israeli public. In fact, they represent a fraction of the Israeli public. In the last elections, those views got very few seats in the Israeli parliament. It's a view that once did very well. Shimon Peres almost won election about 10 times, but never actually did win election ever. He's going to run for president again, it appears, in the coming years or so. But ultimately, in terms of Haaretz, in terms of the negative perceptions that they put out there, many of them that work for Haaretz, they feel that it's their duty, that as Jews, that they have to call the Jewish state to account when they don't uphold what they view as Jewish values. Many of the people that are making these judgments are not particularly versed in what Jewish values are, but they consider themselves qualified to be versed in those values and to pass judgment on others who don't.
It's interesting because you don't see the same level of introspection on the Arab side. You never read in Arab newspapers what the Arab side is doing wrong or how they're culpable for anything. And so a person who reads both sides and knows nothing will say, well, here these Jews are admitting their guilt and these Arabs are claiming that they're totally in the right. So,
look, I remember the first time I met Arafat's press secretary. I came to the Mukata, the office where Arafat worked, and shook hands with the gentleman. He shows me his card, and I looked at the card, and the card was basically the White House correspondent for Al Ayam, which is the PLO daily. it would be as if Tony Snow, the White House press secretary, was also the White House correspondent for the Washington Post. The roles were joined. There was no separation of a skeptical journalist vis-a-vis a press secretary for the government. They're all in the same pocket, and of course, as a result, they're able to put out whatever they want about the conflict, and there's nobody questioning what they're doing. And so you're right, the Arab media does not question the leaders. Al Jazeera is perhaps the exception, and Al Arabiya is perhaps also another exception. They're owned by certain governments. Al Jazeera is actually private. Al Arabiya is owned by government. They are perhaps the new wave in Arab media because they are critical. They're mostly critical of America and of Western policy in the region, but they have perhaps the ability to one day actually be critical of their own regimes as well.
Let me ask you a question about Iraq, if I could. The U.S. congressional elections mean that there's going to be a lot more pressure to pull out of Iraq. If the U.S. were to withdraw from Iraq, do you think the Iraqis would have it together to join as a nation, or the internal rivalry so deep that they would just kill each other until one group became dominant by force?
I never frankly understood why Iraq wouldn't be split up into three nations. You have a very strong Kurdish area, a very strong Sunni area, and a very strong Shia area. The reason why they're not being split up is because the Shias control the oil in Basra, in the southern part of the country. And they are seen as being the most radical, the most likely to go with Iran. Iran already makes $55 billion this year in oil revenues, and there's a fear that that oil would be off the market and your gas prices would go through the roof. However, there isn't much of a glue to keep this country together. There never was. There was a strong man in place who kept it together, like Milosevic did in Yugoslavia and like Saddam Hussein did in Iraq. In the absence of that dictator, and Nouri al-Maliki, as well-meaning as maybe he is, does not have the ability and the power to keep that country together in the long term. And does that mean America should pull out tomorrow? I'm not so sure. It seems to me if they pull out tomorrow, it's going to devolve into militias and mass warfare, and the country is going to go down the drain. Perhaps if America stays a little bit longer, there might be a chance that the security forces would be able to be stood up and they could actually control the country. The jury is very much still out on that. I don't know anybody that feels confident that either of those scenarios is going to happen.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much for your time. I know you're off to give a speech right now, so I'm not going to hold you back any longer. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Marty. Good to see you.
Okay.